Hi, Pascal.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. This is an edition of Worldwise. You are Pascal-Emmanuel Gobry, and you are in Paris.
Yeah.
And that's actually related to what we're going to talk about. You write for Forbes, and you also have you started a marketing research company called Noosphere Inc.
Yeah. Yeah.
And are more theologically conversant viewers immediately think of the mystical, I guess, French Jesuit priest Pierre
Was
Teilhard
French.
de Chardin, whom I might want to talk about at the end of this a little.
Sure.
I've written about him. I'm a fan, kind of.
So am I.
But first, let's talk about what was described as a political earthquake in Europe, something
Right.
that happened last week. They had these elections for the European Parliament, the Parliament of the European Union, and there was what some people found a surprisingly and even alarmingly strong showing
Yeah.
in a number of countries, including yours in France,
Yeah.
by parties that aren't actually all that enthusiastic about the existence of the European Parliament, ironically. They're known as Euroskeptics. Most of them
Yeah.
were described as far right. I think there are a few cases in which maybe some of the Euroskeptics are left wing, but mainly it was considered a right wing showing. In your country,
Right.
that would be the National Front, the Le Pen party. And so, tell me how this looks from your angle.
Um, Thanks for the very broad question. No, it's true. I think the sort of main overall trend is Euroscepticism because within each country, each party has sort of its own history and sort of placement on the political spectrum. But the main trend is that it's Euroscepticism. It's whether you're right, far left or far right. So, for example, in Greece, the sort of far right Golden Dawn party had a sort of disappointing, or quote unquote disappointing for them, I guess, showing. But the far left party had a very, very strong showing, and it's also a Eurosceptic party. So the overall trend is Euroscepticism, and it's really not all that surprising considering how the European project is faring at the moment, which is not very well.
Maybe at this point I should ask you where you stand on this issue. I guess you would probably describe yourself as conservative in some ways, right?
Yeah.
And so how would you position yourself on the Euro enthusiast, Euroskeptic spectrum?
I guess I would call myself a moderate Eurosceptic. It's weird for me in France because I tend to have a sort of British view of Europe, meaning having this sort of big free trade area and economic integration is all to the good, but trying to build a sort of super state doesn't really work. Which is in France, it's either you're for federalism all the way, or you're either against the European Union, or you want the European Union only if it's socialist. But I guess there's sort of short way for me personally would be moderate Eurosceptic. I'm a critic of European institutions, even as I think that European construction was one of the very, very good things that happened in the 20th century.
Okay, and now how would you distinguish that position, your position, from the position of the National Front on Europe and ultimately on conservatism, I guess?
Well, the National Front, so their sort of official platform is they want to leave the euro. They want a complete and first of all, they want to leave the euro, and second of all, they want a complete sort of redrawing of the competencies of the EU in terms of what it can legislate or not. And what they've said is basically we're going to sort of go to Brussels with our list of demands, and if they're not met, we're going to leave the EU.
Which, by the way, we should add is like not going to actually happen because all these parties don't yet have enough. It's not like any of them won 50% of the vote, and it's certainly not like collectively in the parliament. If they all united, which is not clear they could do in the first place for various reasons, it's not like they'd have 50% of the vote. But anyway, their position is that what France should do is what you described. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Right. European parliamentary elections are largely symbolic. I mean, the European Parliament has very little power anyway. The Eurosceptic parties are sort of not interested in having power, exercising power within the European institutions. There was a funny bit when Nigel Farage, the head of UKIP in the UK, was sort of some viewer on a show said, you criticize the EU, but you take a fat paycheck as a member of the European Parliament, and sort of shot back and said, yeah, that's true, but I'm also working to eliminate my job unlike other politicians. That's more of their perspective. So, I mean, to get back to the original point, the European economy is not doing well. There is a widespread sense, one which I would view as empirically correct, that a large part of the economic problems in Europe right now are due to European institutions and the way they work at present. And so people aren't happy and they're voting to show it.
Mm-hmm. And if you said if you identify your position with the British position, then maybe you're not enthusiastic about France being part of the euro either, of the currency union, as opposed to the trade union, right? Is that right?
Right. It's a very complicated question with regard to the euro specifically, because first of all, is it possible to get out without destroying the entire financial system? That's one big question. The other question is, it's clear that the euro at the moment is broken and cannot work. But can you fix it without creating a superstate? Basically, is to my mind an open question. And then there's and that's only the theoretical question. And then the question becomes, can you politically sort of work out some kind of I don't have an easy answer for that, which is, I guess, why I'm a guy who writes on the internet instead of prime minister of someplace.
Could be, although you're pretty young. You never know. So there's that Euroskepticism on the part of the National Front, which again is kind of the French manifestation of what the broad thing we're talking about.
Right.
But there's more than that driving support for the National Front, right? More than this kind of, economic theory issue about the value of being part of the euro, right? What are some of the, at an emotional level, what makes people vote for the National Front in France?
Right. It's mainly a combination of, I would say there are sort of three big groups. The first one, the historic one, the historic one, the core is a bunch of people who are, I don't want to say fascist, but basically fascist.
They're just basically fascist. They're not fascist. Just basically fascist.
I mean, you can sort of dress it up in academies. They're historical heirs to a tradition in French politics, which is authoritarian. So you have the sort of three historic strands of the French right. You have the Orleanists, the Bonapartists, and the Legitimists, and the Legitimists are the far right. But that's a few percentage of the overall population. Then you have added as a layer on top of that, you have a bunch of people who think, justifiably or not, that France has had too much immigration, that the French government is unresponsive to problems that they assume are related to immigration, such as crime and criminality. So basically, issues around immigration and crime.
And is this immigration from Muslim countries in particular, and has the opposition of it kind of taken on that cast that this is kind of about Muslims?
Right. I mean, the short answer is yes. The sort of longer answer is that everybody sort of dances around it because nobody wants to say brown Muslims go out. Mm-hmm. But the short answer is yes. Right. It's cultural fears about nostalgia for the France of the 50s, blah, 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 blah. And then the third layer on top of it is, which is related to the second layer, is dissatisfaction with the economic performance of the country over the past 20-some years. I mean, since the beginning, and France has had mass unemployment now since the oil shock, basically. Like, after the 1973 oil shock, French unemployment went from 5% to 10% and basically never went down, except for like 2 years because of the dot-com bubble. And that creates a lot of malcontent, and French political leaders are seen, justifiably or not, as being either uninterested or incompetent on the issue, or both. As an empirical matter, it is true that the problem still stands unsolved, and it's easy to see how the problems in a sort of zero-sum view of the world, how the problem of immigration can be seen as being connected to the problem of unemployment, can be seen as connected to all these other issues. So that's the sort of three layers that gets the National Front to become not anymore a French party, but having 15%, 20% of French people voting for it.
Okay, and as you look across Europe, how generalizable would you say your analysis is beyond the borders of France? In other words, how broadly is this about immigration? How broadly is it about the economy? And of course, the two can be related because often you blame immigrants who take jobs and stuff. And how much about the appeal of fascism and so on? As you go, beyond France, which of these things keep mattering?
Right. It's I think the same ingredients are always part of the mix, and what changes is the sort of relative importance of the various ingredients. It's pretty funny how all those parties in each country say, "Oh no, we're not like the guys next door." So so Nigel Farage famously refused to have anything to do with Marine Le Pen, because they were trying to do some kind of alliance, whatever, and he said, no, we're not like those guys. And Marine Le Pen is, whenever she gets called a fascist or something like that, she points to some parties in Eastern Europe where they have like people in brown shirts marching down the streets, which the National Front does not have. So there's a kind of funny aspect where it's like, nobody's a fascist, but this guy is.
Right.
So the mix depends on each country's history, idiosyncratic aspects, but the sort of overall trend is basically the same. At least in Western Europe, every Western European country has had, in some form or another, mass immigration. Every Western European country has had some form of shrinking growth and some form of, long-term unemployment, which really becomes like a social disease and not just the ups and downs of sort of economic activity. And every European country has, in some form or another, this sort of historic, sort of extremist milieu, trend, ideology, which sort of always exists, but, most of the time it's just a bunch of guys that nobody pays attention to, and then it connects with other phenomena and it becomes...
Right. And the thing you just described where, some of these Eurosceptic parties will look at other Eurosceptic parties in other countries and go, ooh, gross, we're not like them. I assume that's one of the several things that people think is going to prevent these people from becoming a kind of significant bloc in the in the European Parliament. Right. I mean, the other reason being the one you cited, which is a question of whether the European Parliament is significant in the first place. But leaving that aside, I mean, I guess we're not expecting a very cohesive, kind of 15-20% bloc in the Parliament. Right. No, I mean, again, like the first thing you have to say is that the Parliament has no power. To begin with, so it doesn't really matter very much. But yeah, I mean, the last time around, so if you want to start a group in the European Parliament, it's very much based on your political group. You have to have a certain number of members from a certain number of countries, and they sort of cobbled together a group in the last Parliament. And it fell down because one of the members from, I forget which country, said a bunch of things about how evil and unwashed Romanians are, and then the Romanians in the group sort of slammed the door and left, and so the group collapsed. So something like that is probably bound to happen in the shorter or longer run. But now there's a lot more members of Parliament from Eurosceptic parties who are going to be part of it. One way in which it can affect it is that probably on a lot of votes, the sort of the European People's Party, which is the sort of center-right coalition, and the left-wing party, the European Socialists, are going to have to vote together to pass things, because I think on a bunch of specific votes they're all going to vote no, which will in turn lend credence to the Eurosceptic story that everybody is in on it, and the entire elite is sort of scratching each other's backs, and we're the only ones who can bring real change, because look, they're always voting against each other, so it's a false choice between those guys. Vote for us. So I assume... sorry, go ahead. No, I was saying that's if it affects it, that's probably the way in which it's going to affect it, with that sort of perception. Okay, and then separate from this, there's the question of what this signifies for coming national elections in various countries, which do have more significance, arguably. And how does that look in France? How does this change people's expectations? I don't even know when do you expect the next when do you expect this to matter? When do you bearing death or dismemberment, the next presidential election is in 2017, which is starting to come up. It matters a great deal. I mean, this is the first time in the history of France that the National Front has been the first party in France, the party that got the most votes. So it did get a plurality in France, not a majority, but a plurality of the vote in France. Yeah, that is interesting. It was like 25%, right? Excuse me? It was 25% in France? Something like that, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so what does that? What are people saying about what that'll mean in the next national election? Well, the presidential election is a runoff system, and the goal, as best as I can tell, the long-term strategy of the National Front and of Marine Le Pen. So her father Jean-Marie was not interested in exercising power and being elected. He was only interested in protesting. By all accounts, this is not the case of her daughter. She wants to exercise power. She wants to be elected. The way it would work, what her strategy is, the way she thinks, is if she gets into the runoff
in the next election against a socialist candidate. So last time the National Front was in a runoff, it was against a right-wing candidate. And so both the left and right allied to vote for him. It was Jacques Chirac in 2002. If she's in a runoff against a socialist candidate, I think she thinks, and she might be right, there are millions of French people who have never voted for the National Front in their life, who aren't considering to vote for the National Front, but between the National Front and a socialist, they would vote for the National Front. And so, in such a runoff, she might get 30, conceivably 40% of the vote. And if that happens, it completely changes the political calculus, because the main center-right party today, the UMP, which is already a shambles, would most likely implode. The National Front would have to be acknowledged, I think, by the media as a mainstream party, because you can't say that a party that got 40% of the vote in an election is not a mainstream party. Mm-hmm. And she would become the natural leader of the French right.
So there's no expectation that she would win the election, but she might turn her party into...
Right. Well, if she becomes the natural leader of the French right, then she might get elected in the next round.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And
in any case, that's what I think her long-term strategy is.
And to get even more hypothetical and conjectural,
right?
Should she wind up as president, what kinds of things realistically could you imagine her doing, given the constraints that always wind up facing people once they're actually in office and stuff? Are there fears that people are expressing about what this could ultimately mean in concrete policy terms, or?
Right. We're really in the realm of fan fiction. Can you write, as inconceivable as it is that she could be elected, maybe afterwards she engineers a coup and becomes a dictator and does whatever she wants, right? And sort of this is, it's not to hit the Godwin point, but this is literally what happened in Germany in the 1930s. Mm-hmm.
I would think things would have to get a bit worse economically before that was practical.
Right, a lot of stars have to line up.
Yeah,
so there's a lot of questions. So obviously, France is not France, at least as present, is a republic. So she would also have to win legislative elections. Mm-hmm. Possibly, she would have to rule with some sort of coalition. It's all up to a bunch of hypotheticals. So the National Front clearly wants to shut down immigration completely. That's not allowed by sort of European laws. Mm-hmm. So what, you can imagine a scenario where she does as much as the European laws allow, which, by the way, Nicolas Sarkozy, who campaigned against immigration, already did. But anyway. Or she gives the middle finger to Europe and changes the law and creates a crisis in Europe. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. No.
But the basic agenda of the National Front is, no immigration. Number one, no immigration. Number two, sort of security, crime, crackdown. And number three, in the economic realm, basically socialism. Basically, government, either ownership or control of the main industries, high tariffs, and so on and so forth. That's the agenda. That's the
being against that last thing, I take it.
No, being in favor of it.
Is that right? So
that is correct.
So why are they described as right-wing then, in that regard? You're saying they're... I didn't know that. You're saying they're pro-socialist?
Yeah.
Why are they described as right-wing in a kind
I don't know.
But they are, right?
It, it's a question of definition. I mean, you know,
yeah. In the U.S., that would not
the extremes of the political spectrum. You know, it's more like a circle. Like you end up on the other side.
Right. Well, they're very statist. I mean,
yes.
You know, statism itself is not left wing and can be right wing. It's just that generally, if you throw a very, very strong redistributionist dimension into it, we don't call it right wing. At least in America, we sure don't.
It's very statist, very authoritarian.
Yeah.
Basically, it's the argument of the National Front. They keep disputing their being labeled as a far right party on exactly the grounds you've laid out. Historically, the party comes from the far right. Its agenda is a blend of far right and far left.
Wow. Okay. So, yeah, I would think its fortunes will be very dependent on how the economy goes. But at the same time, the way these things play out, if it continues to flourish without actually gaining power, that will lend strength to its side of all of these arguments. As a practical matter, I mean, as a political matter, you might see the government in power making concessions in these directions, at least incrementally.
Yeah. I mean, that was the governing philosophy of Nicolas Sarkozy when he was as a candidate and as a president. That's why he campaigned against immigration very, very strongly. In his re-election campaign, he put out ads that have been described, in my view, not entirely unfairly, as racist against immigration, with sort of like images of teeming brown masses at the borders of the country and so on, and sort of replaying themes from the National Front. He put in, as I said, as many sort of immigration restrictions as the French Constitution and or European rules allowed, restrictions that have been sort of pointedly not rolled back at all by the socialist government, which had pledged to roll them back, which it's impossible not to view as a political calculus related to the National Front.
And the connection between immigration and Euroscepticism, I assume, is that France's policy on immigration is constrained by its adherence to European Union regulation. There's only so much. It really cannot shut down its borders without essentially
to
leaving
Europeans,
the Union,
right? If you're a member of the EU country, you have the right to immigrate to any other European countries. Period.
Right. So anyone who can get into any member of the EU can get into all of them.
Right.
Now, just quickly, what do you make of the vote in England, where, again, a Eurosceptic party, I guess the Independent Party, did well, but you don't have exactly the same driving forces, at least at the economic level, because, as you said, Britain has stayed arm's length from the Union in the sense of not joining the currency.
Right.
So, although I'm sure that...
And not joining Schengen.
Yeah, now the free trade zone does entail, even without joining the currency, it entails allegiance to a certain amount of economic regulation that people on the right find burdensome, but it's not like... It's nothing like being part of the currency union, right? So, do you see this, the success of that party in England, as kind of a very distinct phenomenon, or in some senses basically driven by the same forces?
It's the answer has to be yes and no. So first of all, Euroskepticism in Britain has its own sort of idiosyncratic history. Britain came late to the European project. There's always been Euroskepticism. Euroscepticism, as such, has always been a live issue in British politics, which is not the case in continental European countries. It can be a live issue in conjunction with other issues, but it's never which is not true. Britain's Conservative Party has always had a large Eurosceptic wing, which sometimes was the majority, in a way that is not true with the sort of main center-right parties in France or Germany or Italy. So that much is certainly true. Now, on the other hand, it's clear that UKIP benefits from similar anxieties related to globalization, immigration, economics, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
The contrast with Marine Le Pen is quite striking, because when you listen to him on economics, when you listen to Farage on economics, he's a Thatcherian. I mean, he's a former stockbroker. He's not,
mm-hmm.
Which is not at all the case of the National Front or any of these populist parties.
Right. Do you happen to know, by the way, the Scottish independence movement, the people who want independence, who want to separate themselves from England? What is their attitude toward the EU? Often, I've noted with secessionist movements, they actually do plan upon seceding to cement themselves to some larger. Thing. So are they planning to be like enthusiastic? Do you know? Are they planning to be enthusiastic members of the EU? Should they ditch England or?
Right. It's sort of in the case of Scotland, I think part of it is a response to sort of scaremongering, because there's a lot of, like, if you choose independence, your currency is going to go poof, your banks are going to go poof, you're going to be pariahs, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And the sort of response to that is to say no, because we're going to be part of the EU, and that's going to support us, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
There was, before the sort of the European crisis, the big argument of the Scottish independence movement was to point at Ireland, which was, the Celtic tiger, really fast growth, really, really astonishing growth story of over 20 years, and to say we're going to be like them, and they're in the EU. Now that story doesn't look so great, because the country is completely obliterated, relatively speaking. But so that was a big part of the story. I agree with you that conceptually it seems really, really strange to say we're going to throw off the yoke of London in order to put on the yoke of Brussels. I agree with you that it is strange. It is. I do not personally follow the logic, but I think it's basically in order to reassure people, because it's voting for independence would be a leap into the unknown.
Well, and it makes a certain kind of sense in that if you are going to sacrifice some of what you might call the economic lubrication between Scotland and England, right? I mean, a nation is always a very kind of smooth trade zone internally, right? Very low barriers to trade internally. Right. Well, if you're going to sacrifice some of that, it makes sense to want to make sure that on other fronts there are low barriers to economic exchange. And so I think the Quebec separatists have always said they would plan to be part of the North American free trade zone. Right. And there's a kind of
economic... It's just a free trade zone, though.
Yeah, well, of course, that's how the EU started, right? I mean, they are both that, and then the EU has taken the logic a lot further politically. But you're right, yeah. It's a lot easier to say you're going to join NAFTA than to say you're going to join there's a lot less entailed in that pledge than there is to say you're going to join the EU. But yeah, and so economically, if a lot of the future fortunes of this whole movement depend on the economy, how are things looking, broadly speaking, in the Eurozone? What are they saying about the next couple of years these days?
In terms of economics?
Yeah, what is the forecast?
Yeah. Well, we all know how reliable economic forecasts
are, right?
It looks like continued stagnation with, some chance of new crisis. Mm-hmm. The fundamental problem of the currency remains, which is that the different European nations have vastly different productivity levels, and that if you have a currency union with different levels of productivity, somebody's going to suffer. Somebody's going to suffer because the currency cannot be at the right level for everybody. And the way we fix that with large currency unions that have a state is through redistribution. So
also through migration of, through fluidity of the labor markets. If people can in the United States, when things hollowed out in the Midwest, people in the Midwest moved to where there were jobs, but there are no language barriers in the United States and no regional allegiances so strong that you wouldn't, So I think that's also an issue in Europe.
And that's the big part of the story of the slow recovery in the U.S. is because people are tied to their homes, and so they can't move to where there are better jobs. Yeah, absolutely. So, that problem has not been fixed. The summary is the euro only works out for Germany, and Germany is the only country with the power to fix it.
So the one country that can fix things has no incentive to do so, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's unfortunate.
So, things still stand the way they stood.
How do people wish Germany would fix things? What does the rest of Europe wish Germany would do?
Basically allow a higher degree of, allow weakening of the euro.
Devaluation of the euro,
which would make the other countries more competitive, even though it would lead to even though it would lead to inflation in Germany.
Right, I see. Okay.
And the problem with Germany is that wages in Germany have been stagnant in real terms for 15 years. That is perhaps more so than the sort of fantasies about Weimar. This is the real reason why Germans and sort of the median German voter, which is the person who matters, have this deathly fear of inflation, because if your wage has stayed stagnant in terms of purchasing power for 15 years, 1% inflation, 2% inflation actually takes a bite out of your life, like actually measurably makes your life worse.
Short term, certainly, yeah. I mean, sometimes wages rise as part of an inflationary cycle, but in the immediate term, right, you would see consumer prices rise.
Right. I mean, you go explain that to an auto worker in North Rhineland.
Right. Okay, well, I actually have a much clearer understanding of this now, I'm happy to say. I wanted to quickly ask you about this marketing firm, just because I think... So the Noosphere, so you named it Noosphere Inc., and we should say the Noosphere was this thing that this Jesuit mystic, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, said was evolving on planet Earth.
He was more of a scientist and theologian than a mystic.
I guess he's commonly described as a mystic. I guess the reason I think one reason he's called mystical is because, on the one hand, I think he was very kind of far-seeing almost in seeing the direction in which things were heading. I mean, he virtually predicted the internet, not in so many words, but he was convinced that there was this global nervous system evolving. Yep. This is back like in the 30s. And I mean, I'm not saying he would have envisioned how the internet works, but he saw that this was the big trend, and this was part of the noosphere, this kind of thinking envelope of the Earth. He saw planet Earth becoming this kind of giant superorganism, and I guess one reason he's called mystical is because when it came to the mechanics of it, he got kind of fuzzy, and of course he was teleological. He was a priest. He saw it as a divine plan, and it was almost as he's, So anyway, he's often described as mystical, and maybe all that means is mystical as Christians go, which is not as mystical as as say some people. But anyway, you were inspired to use his term in naming your company.
Yeah. So the concept of a company, really quickly, we do. Market research, which is in the sense of economic and financial analysis for companies on technology and forthcoming other sectors, and the sort of notion of the company, which, if anything, we are a long time away from, is this idea of, by gathering and understanding as much of the world as we can build a sort of knowledge base, or however you want to call it, that would be kind of like a sort of proto-noosphere, in the sense of less in the sense of the sort of collective thinking brain of humanity, but more like Borges' library, where there's every book ever written, and even every book never written. That's the omega point.
Right, point omega was his other big term, which I guess in modern terms, some people
That's not what we have right now. Right now, we're just a consulting firm.
Okay, you have not reached point omega. Your consulting firm has not reached point omega.
But when I get there, I will give you a call.
Would you please?
Yes, and we'll do a blogging heads about it, where I will presumably appear as this ray of light.
Okay.
Whatever it is.
And I hope we reach point omega before we reach the singularity, because... Although maybe they're the same thing.
That's the question, isn't it? That's the big question facing humanity.
Right, which comes first?
It's omega point, singularity, or extinction.
We should say, for people who want to Google any of this, that noosphere or noosphere is Noosphere.
Right.
And that will take you to the spelling of Teilhard de Chardin.
Right. But everybody watching this took ancient Greek in high school, so we don't have to spell it out.
Oh, I see. you have a touching faith in the pervasiveness of education. Okay, well, listen, thank you. This has been very illuminating.
Yeah, thank you.
Good luck with this point omega thing.
Fingers crossed.
I'll see you on the other side of that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care.